but I wonder that after like for example after 2611 and everything they came up with a solution that P. Chidambaram came up with a solution. We will implant regional energy centers and all so. I wonder why do you think that nation the debate on security doesn't widen its scope beyond that, beyond certain arrest, and that's where it ends. The widening of scope, that where this security the scope will widen in long term, we might protect ourselves something like that.
I think, in fact, the security discourse is the most powerful discourse of our times. I mean, everything is to be seen in terms of security. Even the question of, the women's question has been reduced to a security question. So that CCTVs and commandos and DTC buses, I mean, that's what the feminist question has been reduced to. So I think what we need to do instead of, as you say, widening, what we need to do is to question this whole security discourse and to show it up for its hollowness, that it is. And that it is essentially an anti-democratic kind of a discourse, which says that we must make tough laws, we must make harsh laws, like what Vicky was saying, that doesn't matter even if it's constitutionally not valid, democratically not valid, doesn't matter. Let's have snooping laws. That's what Vicky was saying. That let's have greater surveillance. And the kind of recommendation that it was making, that if somebody comes to somebody's house, people should report it to the police. Going to that extent. So in fact, what we need to do is to question this whole idea of also what is the kind of violence that we see as a security threat, right? When Dalits are murdered or massacred, it's not a security issue. It's not an issue at all, right? Nobody cares. Cobra Post did this, sting operation. How many channels picked it up? The security of the marginalized sections is not an issue. It is not part of the security discourse. It is it's excluded from that, right? So the 93 blasts must be, punished. But the 92 December, communal violence need not be punished. You have the Sri Krishna report; it can be dumped into a cold storage. So we need to keep critiquing this whole security discourse and question it and push its limits. I think that's what we as students and engaged people can do.
I agree that this is wrong, that you try and punish more people, one community, which are related, incidents which are related to one community and not the other. But we realize terrorism exists. I agree that there might be wrong people being picked up here, but then find tougher laws, we say a no to. Then what is the solution besides that?
If you read, if you read any recent book on counterterrorism and all, there's this very interesting book called Indian Mujahideen, a computational analysis. Don't read it; it's terrible. So, what it does is, it's just kind of makes you think. Where lies the solution? Because it talks about some 770 or 600 variables and says how we can predict a terror attack, right? It makes these crazy equations and algorithms and things which are totally beyond me. It goes on and it is 200 pages. And in the end, there's one paragraph saying, yeah, but this is all kind of hypothetical. It has to be corroborated by human intelligence, actual human, intelligence or policing sources. So the point is, yes, terrorism exists, but let's not overhype it also, because a lot of time it's just very overhyped. Okay, if you're going to, malaria and dengue causes more deaths than does terrorism. So, but we're not kind of attending to it with the same urgency that because it's so spectacular, right? The violence of terrorism is so spectacular that we all want to think about it and wonder what can be done. Yes, of course it is there, but we needn't exaggerate it. But also then we need to fix, and if you're going to consistently show our systems and processes to be so unfair, I think we are not going to create a more safer country. If you're going to consistently show that we are biased, we are prejudiced in our policing, in our in our judicial systems, in our punishment processes, then I don't think we're going to make the country any safer. That's true. And also perhaps, I mean, one talks about police reforms all the time. You know, there is the Prakash Singh judgment and so on and so forth, and many organizations work on police reforms. But there's very little talk about accountability when one is talking about police reforms. It's only about, again, it's very technological kind of a solution. Or let them have more, more police. Let there be more. Who's stopping? Let there be more police. Let them have more gadgets. Let them have fancier gadgets. Right? Nobody's stopping that. But also, if you are saying that, what is happening now is that prejudice is taking the place of investigation. What was happening in Punjab, for example, in the 80s or even till the early 90s? You had people being picked up, you had people disappearing, all of that was happening, right? So in fact, there was no policing happening. There was just random terrorizing and bullying happening by the police, right? So what we need to do is to recognize that there are problems with the police. Okay, do whatever you have to do, put more resources into policing and so on, but also, turn them into an accountable police force. A police force which is geared towards citizenship, not towards, some danda wielding, So, there are no easy answers what to do with terrorism. How to deal with it. But of course, you have to, think about how to, this whole thing about, if you go to Batla House area, you will find everybody saying, "Arey, wo informer hai, ye informer hai." Everybody, there's a whole, great deal of paranoia about who's an informer and who's not. But we don't know who is and who's not. But I think there's very little investment into actually real intelligence gathering. That's the sense that I get. You have these chiller type of intelligence gatherers who will give you all kinds of stupid vague information, but no real. So there is lack of intelligence gathering, I feel, at the local level. There is no engagement with the communities as such, even at a more broader level. There is no policing and police and community kind of interaction or trust building exercise. That's not there. So, and also, why do we tend to only think of Muslims when we think of terrorism? Why don't we see terrorism as why Professor Kalburgi gets killed. Somebody walks into his house and shoots him down. Somehow that doesn't strike us as terrorist violence. So these are all questions. There are no easy answers, but I think one can only raise questions about it.
Ma'am, assuming that the premise set and all happens to be absolutely true, all the examples that you've given were from a pre-NIA time frame, if I may use that term. Do you believe that since the NIA has been established, which seems to be a much more accountable, open institution as compared to the ones we had before that, do you believe there has been a change in the way investigation has taken place, or?
NIA was created with a specific purpose. That it was very obvious that Chidambaram didn't trust the agencies which were there earlier, especially the ATS and others. So he had to have his own kind of NIA. But ultimately they were drawn from the same police force. They were not like so they're part of the same police force. And as long as they had a clear political line, to keep, you have to do this and not this. They were pursuing a certain line. But now you see after last year, NIA is not contesting. Look at what's happening look at what Rohini Salian has to say also, right? That they're doing the Malegaon case now, and NIA said we are not asking for the discharge of the the so-called CIMI members, right? And it's not as though it's not built on another model, no? It's the same model, it's the same people. It was just that the political line that they were told to pursue was a different political line. Now it won't be that much difference. So, yeah.
If I may have a cross question, right? When you say that it's not built on the same model, I find that to be not true.
Yeah.
Because the ATS and other agencies which are working before had if I were to follow the same pitch that you're doing, had a double filtering system of the information. First to the state police, which would resonate to the state government, and then to the union government. Whereas the NIA is one which gives information directly to first the NSA and then from wherever that goes. So given that, don't you think that is a completely different model? And
I'm just saying that in terms of the idea of policing, or the idea of investigation, that's not very, different. It's just what I'm trying to say is that it was in a particular political situation that NIA was set up, and it obviously had a certain political line which it was told to follow, right? But now, if you look at all the cases which are unraveling, Samjhauta or the other ones, which the NIA is looking after, Malegaon Samjhauta, Mecca Masjid, all of these cases, the speed at which all of these are unraveling says something about the fact how the prosecuting agency is totally allowing them to collapse also. So, I mean, with a double level of, okay, I mean, in terms of, say, the level of, the procedural level, it may be different from, the other state investigating agencies, but the fact remains that the problems that would afflict, say, the ATS is not simply about whom it is getting information from. It is about the idea of impunity, the idea of, that you can get away by, doing whatever it is. There's no there's no model of accountability. So, given these, constraints, I mean, maybe tomorrow Congress comes back to power and NIA might be a different body, depending on who's the Home Minister, whether it's Shivraj Patil or who. So it's just, I mean, I think that unless we completely overhaul, the way in which policing is done, the way in which investigations are done, and the idea of, this whole reign of impunity doesn't end. It doesn't going to make much of a difference whether it's NIA or you may have another, Modi might have his own other, agency, which he might think is more loyal to him than NIA or whatever.
Hello, ma'am. So again, I think I'm taking a little back here when I ask this question. The term terrorism in itself, even though it remains undefined, carries with it a certain burden of being against the public in large or being against general morals. So do you think, this is something I think you've already addressed partially when I asked this question, that how the term in itself has been appropriated by a particular part of the country or part of the world in terms of against the others kind of attitude. So how there's a major appropriation of the term in itself, and how a part of these crimes which may be equal in terms of the kind of violence or effect they cause on society are generally overlooked because they're unable to fall within that appropriation.
There's I don't know if you've read this book by Talal Asad on suicide bombing. This is a book that everybody must read. He talks about why certain kinds of violence produce such repugnance in us, and certain other violences do not. So he talks about how 9/11 becomes such a important event in world history, as though this was the biggest large scale event of violence. However, that has been imprinted upon our collective and public lives as something which was totally, there's pre-9/11 epoch and there's a post-9/11 epoch, right? So Asad kind of investigates it, and he talks about it, and he says, that there are populations which we can classify into torturables and non-torturables. Right? So he talks about, the violence upon torturables is never a problem. It's Africans die by the dozens every day. Who cares? Children in our tribal areas die every day, but we don't really, care about that. So he says that there are populations which are torturables, and the violence visited upon these torturable populations doesn't, matter to us. Whereas there are certain groups or certain populations which are marked out as non-torturables. They cannot be, touched. So it's the white American population which must not be, it's unimaginable for us that they were violated. So this is how I think we have come to conceive of this double classification of violence, and I think that's what one has to kind of challenge.
We'll just take one last question after that.
So you mentioned a couple of times how you were surprised that the arrests that you spoke about were not linked to any event or violent act of violence. But why is that? I mean, why do you think that was surprising? I mean, wouldn't that be the point of the?
Yeah, that they
Yeah, I mean, why would you say it is surprising?
No, because they're not even saying that they were conspiring to do any violence. Right? It's just that they were meeting. There's this case that we covered in Rajasthan. It's on our website if anybody wants to read it. It's called The Case That Wasn't. So there's this, in 2008, when remember 2008 was a particularly bad year. There was serial blast across the country, in Jaipur, in Delhi, in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and so on. So in Jaipur, 2008 July, I think it was, July, there were these serial blasts in Jaipur. Now, 13th May, that's right. So after that, there were all these young people in Kota who were picked up, about 8 or 9, and they were picked up in connection with this blast. They said, we just want you to come to the police station and we just want to ask you a few questions. All of these were either former members of SIMI, or they had relatives who were in SIMI, or they were just generally Muslim young men who can easily be passed off as SIMI. So they were all picked up. They were then they were all in Kota. Then they were taken to Jaipur. They were put in the special, I think it was the SOG then, and they were arrested with the SOG. So then they were kept in illegal detention for a long time. Then they were taken to judicial custody. Until the time they didn't know what they were being charged with. And then they were told that when they went into the jail, they were put in a cell which had a blackboard outside which said 2008 bomb blast ke doshi, ke dehshatgard. That that's what it said. So they were quite kind of stunned ki ye kya ho gaya, and and all their files and everything, it said 2008 blast case. But ultimately, when the charge sheet was filed, it just said conspiracy to further the activities of SIMI. Because there was nothing about the blast at all. It was only about conspiracy to further the activities of SIMI. And the stories were like, कि ये लोग फलां मस्जिद में मिल रहे थे रात शाम में, रोज मिला करते थे और रोज हिंदुस्तान को गाली देते थे मिल करके. And but it's also interesting in the sense that there were about, I think, more than 35 witnesses, every single of whom turned hostile. And these were not Muslim witnesses. They were, local ordinary sabzi wala, the biryani seller, the local, rickshaw wala, all of these, and all of them turned hostile. So they were like, the affidavit filed in court would say that this witness says that he's a biryani seller, and so the biryani seller's affidavit goes like this, that this man accused came to me and he says, आज हमारी सिमी की मीटिंग होने वाली है, आज हम लोग खूब हिंदुस्तान को गाली देंगे और आज 20 लोग आए हुए हैं, आजमगढ़ से अबू बशर आया हुआ है, भटकल आया हुआ है, बैंगलोर से, well, every possible person who's wanted in India. So he's going to arrive in Kota that day for this meeting. And what are they planning? They're not planning anything except giving galis to India. And the Bagal, there's a mandir next to that masjid, where they're supposed to meet. And that Pujari is also a witness. And he says, kuch nahi the, I never saw them meeting only. They were never meeting there. So this whole, it's not even allegation that they were conspiring to, do a blast or anything. So it's not like, but it's just that they were just meeting and, and the fact that they were associating with each other, which means that SIMI is well and alive. So that is an unlawful activity. And that's the large number of cases. There's no conspiracy. The Delhi cases, of course, are about, we caught him red-handed with RTX and ammunition and so on. Those are those cases. But ultimately, the question then is that where does this RTX come from? Where does all this money come from, which is being displayed in public in press conferences by the special cell? There are photographs. There is this one case, and I just end with that last case. In 2005, I think it was, there was this famous Dholakua encounter case where it's not the special cell but the special branch at that time. It said that we've got this secret information that these terrorists are going to come from Jaipur side onto the highway. And in fact, that hotel, Ecotel, what's that? Uppal, I think. That hotel near the airport. Uppal. So we set up a barricade there, and they had the car number and the color and the make. So we said in the middle of night at 2 o'clock we saw this car arriving from Gurgaon, and we fired, and we asked you to stop. It didn't stop. We fired, they fired, then there was an exchange of fire, and we ultimately caught them. And then we took them to the ITO, to police headquarters, and we held up, and we arrested them. And then the story was actually, and then they were produced in a press conference, and their photographs from newspapers of that time, which the accused actually, they asked somebody to search in the library for that newspaper of that day, because I think Jansatta or Amar Ujala or some Hindi newspaper, which had carried a photograph of the special cell holding these men like little bakris in their hand, and with lots of ammunition under. So now the police story in the court was something else. They forgot to account for this press conference. So they said we caught them, and then by that time it was already 12 o'clock, and then we produced them for the magistrate and so on. So then the accused said, but what happened to your press conference? They said, oh, what press conference? We didn't do a press conference. So very dramatically the accused produced this newspaper in the court with the press conference was actually held. The real story was that these Kashmiris were actually businessmen who had come from Kashmir to do some business in tea or something, and they were staying in a hotel in Dholakpur, in Karol Bagh, and then there were other Kashmiris who were also staying there. Lots of Kashmiri businessmen come here to take to trade, and they were all staying there. And then one day, this special branch officer, who is now in the special cell, he landed up there and he demanded money, and they did not give him money, and this whole hotel was converted into a torture chamber, and these people were tortured. And every day there would be a police van which would take them to Dholakpur special branch office. There would be negotiations and bargaining about how much money the traders would give them. Some, of course, managed to give the money and they went off. But these unfortunate ones who thought, that they hadn't committed a crime, and so why should they pay up these lakhs of rupees which the special branch was demanding, they were they were produced before the press as people who'd been caught in this great encounter drama. And the Sessions Court actually wrote that this drama of encounter has been scripted sitting in the office. Nobody ever went to the hotel because the police couldn't identify which spot, what. So the whole entire drama had been scripted. The Sessions Court asked for an FIR to be filed against the police officers, but the High Court turned it down.
I think.
Manisha, is if you look increasingly, there's in the Supreme Court's discourse that India's normal time constitution is increasingly more different from its emergency constitution. And its peacetime is no different from a state of war or state of emergency, because the kind of laws you have, the kind of things that have been upheld by the court. Now the difference is sort of blurred. I was wondering, what is, in terms of challenging this discourse, do you see the court as an ally, or given that given its own performance when these legislations have been taken to for check, sort of test of constitutionality, the court has been so deferential to the legislature. Do you see the court as an ally, or I mean, I'm just wondering where you see the sort of chipping away starting with this, given that, even though it's interesting to see the lower courts saying that you clearly you're fabricating evidence, but yet you have the Supreme Court buying into this sort of terror exceptionism without basically no questions asked. So I was just interested to see your own thoughts. Where does this reversal start happening?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. No, I think we just have to be very strategic about it. That without illusions about this idea that the courts will uphold the rule of law and so on and so forth. I think without harboring those kind of illusions, I think we must try and extract anything that we can from there. Because if you look at, for example, the Madhya Pradesh lower courts, they're pathetic. They're really horrible. They're saying that yes, there's no evidence, but Simi is a great terrorist organization and we are facing terrorism, and so therefore there's no question that we're not going to convict you. They're saying that in the 3-page judgments of these big terror cases, 3-page, 4 pages judgment saying okay, there's no evidence. So, but I think at the same time there is process of filtering which is happening also, which we see in other cases. So I think one only without I think harboring any great illusions about the possibility of justice flowing from the courts, but I think we need to kind of keep trying to extract whatever one can from them. But I think it would be great mistakes to go to the Supreme Court seeking constitutional, I think that those were great mistakes that one went to court for seeking, Pota and Tata. I think those experiments should not. So one should be very sparing, I think, about going to the court in cases like that. That's what I think. I may be completely wrong, but I think there shouldn't be any illusions that we should. And this whole thing about rushing to the court with the PIL saying that I think that the courts have changed remarkably over the last few years, and to expect them. I mean, it's quite obvious even in labor cases, for example. It's so obvious, that courts are increasingly anti-labor, anti-employee. So I mean that's part of the whole package, I think. But wherever one can, extract some advantage, one should try without saying, the courts are instruments of the ruling class and so on.
Thank you, ma'am, for taking time